Welcome to EWTN News live coverage of Pope Francis in Cuba. I'm Raymond Arroyo. In a few moments, we'll bring you the Pope's meeting with Raúl Castro from the Revolution Palace in Havana. With commentary and color are members of our aptly named Papal Posse. Robert Royal, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Father Gerald Murray of the Archdiocese of New York, and joining us for our Cuba portion of the coverage, Father Roberto Cid, the director of Radio Paz in the Archdiocese of Miami. Now, look, if you have a question, if you have a comment about any of our coverage, you could, the nice comments we'll accept, at papalvisit@ewtn.com, or you can try us on Twitter. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. I'll be live tweeting throughout. Let me know what you're seeing during this very long block. Now, here's what's ahead, okay? The Pope is scheduled to first meet with Raul Castro, followed by a Vesper service with his clergy in Cuba. That'll be religious and seminarians at the Cathedral of Havana. And finally, a meeting with students. Now, you will not want to miss a moment of this coverage. Sure to be something incredible. I want to give people a little update while you were away, or while we were away from you. The Pope met with Fidel Castro. Now, this was a trip that was talked about. Some said it might happen, it might not happen. It did happen. They decided not to provide any photos or video of this visit. What does that tell you, Robert Royal?
Well, I think the only conclusion we can reasonably draw from this is that Fidel is hurting very much. He's either in a wheelchair or he's bedridden, and they didn't want to expose his frailty at this point.
Father, you will remember in years past when Pope Benedict was here, and Father Roberto was with me at the time, he met with Fidel Castro, and we have some video of that meeting. As you can see from the video, Pope Benedict is a little leery, wary of this. He did not want to have this meeting. What happened? What's the background on this?
Bob, you want to take that?
Yeah, I've heard through sources who will not be named that Benedict, before he arrived in Cuba, had pretty much given out the word that he did not want to meet with Fidel. When John Paul II visited in 1998, Fidel was still president, he was still more vigorous, and of course they met, and the two great Cold War figures encountered one another finally. But Benedict, for whatever reasons, did not want to meet with Fidel, and Fidel, unannounced, showed up at the nunciature, and there was a lot of uncomfortable encounter there. And I'm also told, we've checked this, and it's true, that shortly after Benedict returned to Rome, that nuncio was no longer nuncio to Havana. So
he was replaced.
He must have been, perhaps it was already scheduled, but I think we can draw the conclusion that he was replaced.
Now let's talk about the exchange of gifts. Apparently there was an exchange of books between Fidel Castro and Pope Francis. What does that tell you? First of all, you tell us the books that the Pope received from Castro. It was this Fidel and Religion book. What do you read into that?
Yeah, that Castro is offering a left-wing book, you know, trying to basically praise Fidel as being an exemplary Christian and all the rest, and the Congress between Christianity and communism. That's just propaganda, to be very blunt. And Fidel received, though, from the Pope some very interesting books, some catechetical books about the content of the faith. And then he received 2 CDs and a book with homilies by one of his old teachers, a Jesuit priest named Armando Llorente, who was a Spaniard but worked in Cuba, and then eventually ended up in Miami. I think, Father Cid, that you actually knew him.
Oh, sure.
Really?
He died in Miami about, I would say, 4 or 5 years ago. His funeral was very well attended in the Jesuit Church, which is the Church of the Jesuits in downtown Miami, the oldest parish in Miami. And at the time of his death, he was the director of the John Paul II Retreat Center, run by the Agrupación Católica Universitaria, which is a grouping of university students formed in Cuba. Many of them were active in politics in the Christian Democrat Party in Cuba, and who were kicked out by Castro. And Father Llorente himself, like many the school that Castro himself attended. Operates now in Miami, Belen Jesuit School.
So what do you think is the reaction of Fidel Castro receiving this collection of his former university instructor who died in exile?
I think that he must have been shocked. You know, people say that that Castro always had reverence for Father Llorente. I think it's more telling about Francis. You know, Francis is a man of gestures. He speaks through his gestures, through what he doesn't say, through the gifts that he gives you. So having that mindset in view, I would think that it's a way for him to tell Castro, you know, I know that there's all these people that you have kicked out and that are out there. Some of them very close to you, indeed, you know.
I want to go now to Susie Pinto, who's going to be joining us. She is in Havana on location. Susie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Raymond.
Some protesters apparently were arrested and detained this morning. Among them, the ladies in white. Now, this is what they feared, that they would be arrested. You've spoken to the leader of that group. Tell us what happened.
That's right, Raymond. We're learning more about that incident that took place as the Mass was beginning this morning. There were 3 people who tried to approach Pope Francis as he was riding in the Pope Mobile. They were quickly detained and arrested. I spoke with Berta Soler, who is basically the head of the Ladies in White. Now, she says that they were human rights activists who were trying to get a letter to Pope Francis. In that letter, they were trying to call for an end to violence against dissidents. She says they were arrested and they are still in police custody. And of course, she and a group of other women who work with her, the Ladies of White, were arrested. They were released at 10 a.m., too late to get to the Mass.
Terrible. Tell me, Pope, we heard from Pope Francis, you know, during the homily and his subsequent Angelus address. He stayed very close to script, which, as you know, someone who watches him all the time, that's not always the case. Usually he's a little freer, he departs from the text. He avoided any direct reference to the Cuban regime, though he addressed the problems in Colombia directly. Why?
That's right. The Pope called on the Colombian government and rebels in that country to come to an accord to make peace. Of course, those talks are going on here in Cuba, and the Pope was very clear. He asked them, he said, now is the moment, and we cannot let a peace deal must be reached. So the Pope is obviously very clear when it comes to politics in that country. Of course, here he was more prudent and discreet.
The Pope is going to meet apparently later today, Susie, with some young people this afternoon. We will be bringing that, of course, to the audience live. You talked to some of those young Cubans. Now, from the data we're seeing, faith is not exactly something beating in the heart of every young Cuban or any Cuban at all. I mean, 5% are practicing. What do they tell you, those you've spoken to?
Raymond, I was with them on Friday night as they held a celebration in the square outside the cathedral. There were about 150 of them. They were very joyous, excited. They were singing and dancing. And they tell me that even though here in Cuba, religion obviously is something that has been restricted for so many years, they were so overjoyed to welcome the Pope, and they are carrying out his mission of bringing the gospel to everyone in this society. And they will, yes, as you said, they will be meeting with the Pope later this afternoon, and they are a small group perhaps, but solid and very hopeful as things change, they told me.
Very good. Susie Pinto, thanks for the updates. We will check in with you later. Very good. Tell me your reaction to this. I mean, we expected, and I suppose it's rather illustrative to see this regime acting in this way while the Pope is really in the perimeter of the Pope's Mass. It's kind of by the book for the Cuban regime.
Well, we heard yesterday from Raúl Castro that the UN Charter is fully in force in Cuba. We also heard that the Cuban Constitution guarantees freedom of religion. Well, not for those people who want to circulate some information to their fellow citizens. It is a police state. The Pope is there, of course, to bring a message that's different. And I'm very glad in this gift of books that he's, you know, highlighting for Fidel Castro and for everyone who's paying attention. You have to get your soul in order with God. And what you learned as a child from this wonderful Father Llorente, go back to it. Go back to it. These tactics remind me of East Germany and the Soviet Union. They're no longer around. So perhaps Cuba should pay attention.
And there's some video there in the double box. You could see some of the video of those arrests taking place. This was, again, on the perimeter of the mass and really in full view of journalists, of everybody, which is unfortunate in one respect, illustrative in another. We got some emails. In fact, there was one that came in earlier today, and it was talking about the nature of our coverage and complimenting you all particularly. And I'll read this to you because I think it bears airing. As a Cuban watching the Mass from Havana, I have to thank you and show my gratitude to Robert Royal, Father Murray, and Father Sid for saying the truth about our country. Usually it is not said as it is, and both of them know well, all of you, what you're talking about. I can just say thank you for letting the world know the truth. Many blessings. Continue being the messenger of truth when a lot of people have it all wrong. What's happening here? May God bless you all, and thank you for teaching the truth. And that was from Maria. So that's a very edifying, nice thing to hear. Sad that we have to report these things, but I think we get nowhere. I mean, the Pope is a great advertiser of this notion that we have to apprehend reality and face it as it exists. We can't live in some fantasy world. And I think too often, particularly with the Castro regime, people have sort of lived with the blinders on. The Pope is about to meet Raúl Castro. You're getting some images here of the outside of the Revolution Palace, the so-called Revolution Palace in Havana. The Pope will be meeting here with Raúl Castro. We don't know quite how in-depth this video will be or what we'll see of this meeting. My sense is this is going to be not unlike President Obama's meeting with the Pope later in the week. When they will meet, they'll have a public ceremony, and then the real meeting will happen behind closed doors. But what do you expect from this? What can we expect from this meeting?
Well, I think we're going to see some more boilerplate on the Castro side. As Father was saying, I mean, first of all, what country announces that the UN Universal Declaration of Rights is in force in its country? France doesn't do this, America doesn't do this, Italy doesn't do this. It's assumed that a decent country has already implemented steps that allow human rights, freedom of religion, etc. The fact that that is asserted is one of the biggest lies that you can possibly tell in a police state like Cuba. And as awful as it was to see that footage of those protesters, the whole world now is seeing quite openly, when its attention is focused on a little country like Cuba, what in fact is going on in that island.
Actually, the Vatican, I literally just got this. I'll tweet this out to everybody. You can find it on my Twitter page in a second. Alex Castro, Fidel's son, just tweeted a picture out of the Pope shaking hands with Pope Francis. So the Vatican must have put the kibosh on these pictures because they didn't want to have that photo of the Latin Pope in any way endorsing, in a bold way, Fidel Castro. Yet the photo has emerged from the Castro family. This is kind of operating procedure.
Well, I mean, everybody wants to have their picture taken with the Pope. Everyone wants to claim the Pope for their idea or their side, but the Pope is beyond that. I think that he takes calculated risks, as any priest does. You know, as John Paul II did, for example, when he met with the Iraqi foreign minister a few days before the beginning of the war. Not that he endorsed Saddam Hussein, he was just trying to discharge his duties as a successor of Peter. And similarly, the Pope is the universal shepherd. He's concerned about the souls of every single human being.
Fidel Castro is no longer the head of this country. There's no good reason for him to meet with him.
But perhaps they requested it. Who knows, you know? And I think that perhaps the Pope exhorted him to conversion. I mean, the fact, as Father was pointing out, those catechetical books, I mean, the man is, what, 88, 89? Yeah. He's already at the threshold of his particular judgment by Christ, so he'd better get ready. And the Pope, as a priest, is urging him to get ready, I guess.
The sands of time are wearing down for poor Fidel Castro, or not so poor. But anyway, the picture is out there. In fact, we will try to put it up for you a little later. I want to move on to something that's happening in a backdrop of this meeting. There has been this huge restoration of the relationship between the United States and Cuba. Pope Francis was at the very center of that. This is a clip of President Obama talking about this newfound relationship and the man responsible for it.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries. In particular, I want to thank His Holiness Pope Francis, whose moral example shows us the importance of pursuing the world as it should be, rather than simply settling for the world as it is.
What do you see there? What are you hearing there? It seems as if the president is obviously trying to use the Pope as well to propel this, the lifting of the embargo, which is part of this restoration of the relationship. I want to call everybody's attention before we go on. Pope Francis limping a little bit. He's really limping badly since the Mass this morning. There he is meeting with Raúl Castro, and we can't hear the conversation, but they're laughing and joking a little bit here as this official meeting of the Pope with the President of Cuba. Now, some of our correspondents, even in Cuba, were registering their disdain for using the title President when referring to Raúl Castro, in that he really wasn't elected, but that this is a dictatorship.
It's a dynasty, as
Right.
The Pope said in his opening remarks yesterday.
Full military honors there, and guard is in place. The Pope, Father Sid, you were talking earlier about the Pope suffering from sciatica, that this is a long time.
It is well known that he suffers from sciatica, so, and he may have, I don't know, a bout, perhaps that's why he's limping, you know.
Yeah, he's really limping. This morning at the Mass, it was noticeable, but now you can see he's really sort of...
Now it's the elevator, I think if you remember from when we did Benedict, remember that they took him on the elevator?
Yes, yes. Look, there's the elevator. Just went into the Get Smart elevator. Now, that may be the last image we get of this meeting, okay? We'd been promised a meeting. Well, they're pretty flowers.
That's the upper floor of the elevator. There you go.
Oh, here we go. Okay, this does continue. This is really like a reality show. We've got cameras in every room. And there the Pope is making his way here to meet with officials in the Cuban regime. Having already met with Fidel Castro earlier today, here he is with his brother Fidel. This is EWTN's live continuing coverage of the Pope. Every moment of his visit in Cuba, we will bring it to you straight through his arrival here in Washington, D.C., to New York, to Philadelphia, and as he takes off for Rome. It's going to be quite a week, and it's already been an incredible few days here. Pope is making his way in.
I think it's the same place where we saw Benedict with Castro. Now
Correct.
they're going to sit.
Right, they'll go to the end of that hall and then
Yes.
sit, yeah. And while we wait for the Pope and Raúl to be seated here, this is the picture of Fidel Castro meeting with Pope Francis a little earlier today. The Pope went to visit him at his home, which some describe as a sort of swanky nursing home in some of the reports I've read. There's that photo. He's in his jogging suit, ready to run a marathon, I guess is the message there. But this was taken by Castro's son, apparently, and tweeted out. And naturally, we all got our hands on it pretty quickly. Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, shaking hands with Raúl Castro back in the presidential palace, Palace of the Revolution. Other members of the papal party being introduced to Raúl Castro. Again, this is sort of a protocol of every visit. This is the Pope wearing his head of state hat. Tell us the difference, Father Jerry.
Well, the Pope, as the head of the Catholic Church, the Supreme Pontifex, the Bishop of Rome, is a spiritual leader, but he is also the head of state of the Vatican City State. Now, the Holy See is very careful that they maintain that diplomatic relations are established between the Holy See, an institution of international juridical right, with the different governments. But of course, in his capacity as head of Vatican City State, he receives the honors and protocols associated with being head of government, head of state when he travels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a key distinction. That's Father Lombardi, the Jesuit head of the communications apparatus of the Vatican, who was shaking hands with Raúl Castro. It's very difficult to hear what they're saying.
I'm not getting any audio.
You're not getting any
this,
audio.
So I think we
I'm
just
getting a very faint.
Have to see what's being done. These look like members of the Cuban.
Yeah, it's all sort of ambient
regime.
sound at this point. So
Yes.
we really don't have a sense of what's being said. But it seems to be just
This is all
general
this is
protocol
stuff,
and introductions.
It's normal.
Yeah.
You know, harking back to President Obama just a few minutes earlier, ran that cut.
Yes.
It's interesting that he invokes the Pope when it comes to the issue of Castro in Cuba, but he will not listen to the Pope when it comes to religious liberty in this country. And that's something I hope the Pope is going to speak about forcefully, especially in Philadelphia and also in Congress. You know, it's nice to have some window dressing to support your foreign policy. The way this country treats its religious members, that's even much more important. And I'm sure the Pope's going to remind us of that.
No doubt. No doubt. And you are watching live coverage. That is Raúl Castro and Pope Francis, having gone through the protocol, the introductions of their respective parties, their entourages. They are now retiring to a private meeting. And if Pope Benedict's visit with Castro gave us the model, they will now retire. And you see the two of them now walking alone into this section of the Palace of the Revolution. And I don't know how long. This portion is actually supposed to go on until 5 o'clock Eastern, so a full hour of this meeting, which seems a bit long. I'll bet it wraps up sooner than that, by the looks of things. Oh, and there it's exactly the same setting as Pope Benedict's meeting.
With a lush tropical setting.
Yes. It looks like they're in a botanical garden and on the deck, the marble deck.
And no translators needed on this one.
That's a very interesting.
Although interpreters
no.
would be needed.
Interpreters always needed.
Now, Raúl Castro is checking his camera there. How long do we have? I was asking the same question, Mr. President. He was checking his watch there. But this, again, talk about the impact of having a native speaker from the region, at least, if not the country. It is a different sort of conversation.
That makes it more intimate, I think, and it allows the Pope the opportunity to be direct. I think that, again, the Pope never forgets that he's a priest, and he sees himself first and foremost as a priest. All popes do, but this one in particular. And so perhaps there's a call to conversion. There's an exhortation to turn to God, you know. I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of the conversation. I mean, I'm sure Castro would like to stall and tell him about the achievements of the revolution and things like that. But thinking about Francis and the way we see him act, he sees himself as a priest ministering to somebody who is on a path to perdition. And I mean, and the Lord Jesus shed his blood for every single human being that ever was, is, or will be. So priests have to be his presence and lead, especially the strayed sheep, back to Christ. You know. So.
Yeah, no, that's what this moment. I mean, it almost looks like they're having a confession here. By the all you need is all we need is a screen in between them. But
it would take a lot longer than an hour.
Or a stole, or
Pope
somebody
springs
to bring
eternal, Robert.
For somebody to bring a stole to the Pope. You know? But I mean, but we have to hope for that. The man obviously has a hardened heart.
Sure.
The man is responsible for horrible crimes.
Yes.
But as Christians, we have to hope against hope that he turns back to Christ and opens his heart to the healing grace of Christ for the good of Cuba, for sure, but also his eternal salvation is at stake. So
I think it's significant that when Raúl came out of the meeting at the Vatican, that he talked about, if the Pope continues this way, I may go back to Mass. I mean, in some ways it's cynical and it's manipulative, but the fact that he would even think in those terms it does indicate that there's still something alive within him that could be appealed to.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, the Cuban Revolution started with a rejection of Christianity, although when they were in the Sierra, they claimed to be Catholic and defending the church, but very quickly their agenda was clear. They became the biggest allies of the Soviet Union. They sent armies over to Africa to support other guerrilla movements. They are terrorists in South America.
They expelled priests.
They expelled priests.
Even some of them who were born in Cuba. There's
Yeah.
the famous case of the auxiliary bishop of Havana,
Yeah,
Bishop
Maza
Bosa Masvidal, who ended
yeah.
up in Venezuela, and who the priest who later became Bishop Roman in Miami, who was kicked out of Cuba, together with many other priests. Those are the two most famous cases. Some of them Spanish, some of them foreigners,
right.
some of them Cubans were kicked out. We mentioned Belen, the Jesuit school in Havana, who was seized and turned into a military academy, and Belen now functions in Miami. The Villa Marista of the Marist brothers was seized and turned into a prison.
Yeah.
The Agustinian University, Santo Tomás de Villanueva, was seized and closed down, and it now operates in Miami as St. Thomas University, and the list goes on and on and on.
You are seeing at the same time Raul Castro and the Pope are meeting. There is a concurrent meeting going on with members of representatives of the Holy See and the Cuban government. This is happening in a separate room. That's what this footage is. So they've cut away from that one-on-one meeting with Raul Castro and Pope Francis. And the idea is, I guess, to give them some private time. I would bet, I think Father's right, there probably is a spiritual character to some of this. And you see from the intimacy of them sort of hunched over talking to one another at the chairs. It's a very different posture than we've seen even from the last two pontiffs with interacting with these fellows.
You know, this Pope, since he's a Spanish speaker and someone familiar with the history of Cuba much more than the previous two popes, just from a point of view of living in Latin America, this is a chance for him to talk to someone who's doing a lot of harm, but to call him to conversion.
Yeah.
It's also on the other side, though, look at it this. They started the revolution kicking out the church. The revolution is just one big nightmare of a train wreck. And who are they talking to now? They talk to the Pope. The Pope is not going to give them legitimacy, but the Pope gives Cuban people hope.
Robert, so often, I think particularly for young people, Fidel Castro is seen almost as a countercultural figure, an avuncular kind of revolutionary type who, you know, is an elder statesman, kind of a fun guy. He goes on a bit on TV, and that's kind of the only impression they have. Tell us about the man himself and this revolution that the Pope has walked into here in Cuba.
Well, I mean, we know that he was one of the great charismatic figures of the 1950s. He was the one that was actually able to inspire that revolution. And you're right, in a way that there's a kind of aura around him as almost a living Che Guevara. There's still this element of romantic Marxist revolution that went on. But of course, it was very early on, it became very brutal. We've been talking about the way that it expelled the church, you know, et cetera. I'm old enough to remember when college students used to go and cut sugar cane for Fidel. Very white, very middle-class American college students during their summer vacations would go down and cut sugar cane for Fidel. So it's a romance that goes way, way back, and it's part of that mythology that I talked about this morning of the left, that there are certain countries, Vietnam is one, Chile is another, Spain is another, where the international left, the far left, has to keep its bona fides with these countries, because otherwise the whole narrative of revolution and anti-Christianity and anti-Westernism falls apart.
Starts to teeter. We are in a moment going to take some of your questions. I know many of you are sending those in. Continue to do so. I'm at Twitter at Raymond Arroyo, or you can send me an email at papal visit, not pastoral visit, papal visit at EWTN.com. We will get to those. And many questions are coming in. Some are asking about the Argentinian and Latin American take on what's being seen here. So how is it, I mean, I know how the United States is viewing this. Many in the U.S. are saying, you know, the Pope is going to go in and try to shake up Cuba and change what's happening. How is it being viewed in Latin America?
That's a very good question. I was checking the headlines of the Argentine newspapers, and they emphasized the call for reconciliation of the Pope, and they were highlighting the call for the Colombian peace talks to proceed along, and also his reference to what he had already mentioned before, the third World War in stages that we're witnessing in the world. The visit with Castro is something that is noted in passing, but I mean, it's not at the core, at least not what I saw, the core of the coverage. For Argentinians, I would say that Fidel Castro is a very distant figure. For those who are older than 60, perhaps they have more of a position about him, you know. But unless you're really into politics, people don't really care much about Fidel Castro.
He's a forgotten figure.
He's a forgotten, I would say, yes. And Cuba is more than anything else nowadays a tourist destination.
Yeah, but for the people who still live under this regime, he is certainly not a forgotten figure. In fact, he's an omnipresent figure, and they're sort of left with the fallout. And I was struck by something Susie Pinto said earlier, that, I met with all these young people that were very excited. Well, how many were there? 150. Well, most of the people there, and I've read a lot of reportage, and I know other reporters are down there now, many of those young people are just brokenhearted. They don't see a future in this place because of the nature of the regime.
Yeah, I think we have to assume that even in Cuba, where the hatches are battened down, that information travels now. There's a lot of digital information. There is some internet. Even 17 years ago, there was some internet in Cuba. So they're aware of how different things are. But I think Father is absolutely right that, look, communism, for all intents and purposes, collapsed 25 years ago. Many of these people were not even born.
Right.
I run a program every year in Eastern Europe, and when I first started it 10 years ago, there were students who still remembered because they were in school. They were very young, but they were in school when communism was running. And very concretely, the day or two after Christmas, the teacher would come in and say, "Well, who went to Mass on Christmas the other day?" And these poor young children would be caught between, they were told by their parents never to tell a lie. But on the other hand, they were always told never to tell people when you go to church.
Right.
So they would remember the repression. 5 or 6 or 7 years later, I was starting to get students who didn't, they knew that this existed in the past, but viscerally it wasn't there any longer. So we're really a generation removed from the time when Cuba was sending troops to Angola, making trouble in Latin America, ally of the Soviet Union, etc.
Some people don't even know about it.
They don't recognize
Well,
that.
and Cuba was recently released and removed from the State Department's list of terrorism instigators, which of course they were, but I think to hasten this rapprochement, they've been removed. Now, the goal of both Cuba and the United States is to lift the embargo, have the embargo lifted. Give us a sense of what that embargo means. We hear that term, the United States embargo. In truth, the fact, food, medicine, these things are always sent and have been sent to Cuba by nations around the world, including the United States. Yes. What are we really talking about?
No, what we're talking about here is access to capital, which is precisely what they want. They want
the World Bank.
And the World Bank. Credit. Credit from banks. They want banks to lend them money. Cuba's infrastructure is horrendous. They need tons of investment, and they can't get enough money from European banks to do all that. They want that. They want the stigma of being against the U.S. against them to disappear. But they want to manipulate it just the same. We were mentioning this program that they have to send doctors overseas. They have a lot of doctors because they have a big medical school program and all. They always talk about it. But those doctors aren't paid. The governments that bring them in pay the Cuban government, and then these people get a subsistence wage. It's not good at all. No. And I'll tell you, as regards the embargo, the Cuban government is looking for money to support itself. And that really is the sad story here.
About.
The Cuban people will benefit when they're given the same freedoms that the Argentinian and Italian people have.
We are going to take a very short break, and then we will hopefully come back and bring you the conclusion of this meeting, which is a private meeting between Raul Castro and Pope Francis. Our EWTN News live coverage continues in a moment. Stay right there. EWTN News live coverage of Pope Francis in Cuba. I'm Raymond Arroyo. We are awaiting Pope Francis's exit from the presidential palace, the Palace of the Revolution, where he is meeting with Raúl Castro, the head of that country. I am joined once again by the papal posse, Robert Royal, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Father Gerald Murray of the Archdiocese of New York, and Father Roberto Cid, the director of Radio Paz in the Archdiocese of Miami. We are taking your questions. Many of them are coming in via Twitter. I'm at Raymond Arroyo, or you can email us at papalvisit@EWTN.com. We are awaiting, by the way, another event which is coming up momentarily. Following the Pope's exit from the Palace of the Revolution here, we will take you to a Vespers service. He's going to pray with religious and seminarians in Cuba, and then he'll meet with young people there. So you don't want to miss any of that. This is going to stretch on till 7 o'clock Eastern time. So if you're watching from other locales, ignore that time entirely. Just stay with us. You're not going to want to miss any of this. People are asking, why do you think, again, this is something we talked about a little earlier, but they're still confused. Why do you believe the Vatican suppressed the picture of Castro? What would be the political import of having the two of them seen together?
Well, as Father said earlier, that it's always the case that people like to have their picture taken with the Holy Father because it looks like he's one of my best buddies, that somehow they're on the same page. And this really goes to the playbook that this sort of socialist has had for a long time, that we are the real Christians. You know, the Christians in the old Havana who were allied with the rich. You know, you always talk about this. They were allied with the rich. They were these elite schools that Fidel and Raúl themselves went to. That's really a false church. We're the ones who are carrying out Jesus' message to take care of the poor and whatnot. Now, this is utter nonsense. It's something that's been repeated in a variety of places, and unfortunately among the left here in the United States as well. But there's no question that for at least for internal propaganda purposes, this can be quite powerful. I think in the world at large, much less so.
Yeah, and I have to say, despite the image that's been released, Fidel Castro looks really bad in the picture. I mean, it looks like he's just got out of his wheelchair or his chair, and he's sort of, you know, teetering there. He looks drawn and not well, but he hasn't been well for a long time. Now, talk about the ladies in white. A number of people are saying for 27 consecutive Sundays, these women have been arrested outside of Sunday Mass. Give us a little background on the ladies in white as well as the dissident community in Cuba. What do you know?
Well, what I know is that it's very fragmented, that nobody knows who's who. I think I go back to when we did Benedict, remember our man in Havana. Nobody knows who's who there. One of the leading figures of the dissidents, a very devout Catholic, by the way, Osvaldo Payá, died 2-3 years ago in a car accident in very dubious circumstances. There's allegations that he was assassinated by the regime. So I think that that's part of the problem with this kind of situation, that civil society is practically non-existent because it's been deliberately crushed by, I mean, you need to destroy institutions, civil society, because to the extent that there are no civil society, no institutions, then alternatives to your government cannot flourish. And it's a constant there. So the dissidents are very fragmented, and nobody knows who's who, as far as I know.
And this notion of dictatorship and popular figures, this is not something lost on Pope Francis, who grew up in Argentina, and Perón's Argentina during much of his young adulthood, childhood. Give me a sense of who was Juan Perón, who was Eva Perón, just to try to put the Pope's worldview in some context. And then I'd like to talk about how that informed his vision of politics as well as engaging regimes like this, as well as the United States and beyond.
You have to ask Father about that. I mean,
that's right, you're the Argentinian.
Well, I mean, Perón was a very charismatic leader. He was in the army. He was a colonel and part of the cabal or group that seized power in 1943 through a coup.
Right.
I mean, not to bore people with Argentine history, in 1943 there was a coup, and then Perón was very much part of that coup. And he had himself appointed Secretary of Labor. And from that position, he built up his power base because he deliberately sought out the trade unions, which were, for the most part in Argentina, up until his arrival, dominated by anarchists and communists because of the influx of German and Italian immigrants and Spanish immigrants to Argentina. So his inspired idea was to build his political movement based on an unlikely coalition of the base of support that he had in the army and trade unions.
Yeah.
And then when in 1945 he was removed because the military government got afraid of all the power that he was amassing, he got removed. He was briefly jailed. That's where Eva Perón comes to the fore.
Yes, he marries Eva. She was a kind of quasi-film star, B-movie
and
character.
because she is the one who is claimed to have organized a massive demonstrations to demand the release of Perón from jail on October 17th, 1945. Then in 1946 there were elections and Perón won.
He comes to power.
Perón won the popular vote and became the president of Argentina. In 1949 he reformed the constitution and had himself re-elected in 1952, and in 1955 he was toppled by a coup.
But the Pope has, in a lot of the biographies, there's a sort of grudging respect for Perón about who he was and what he represented.
Well, it's that populist side of the Pope as well. And as I understand it, Father Cid, there are various Peronismos. There are various moments of Perón where he's a more populist figure, sometimes leaning into the left or to the right, or comes back, understanding that the situation in Argentina has changed, and if you want to exert power, you have to operate in a different way. But I think it is probably true that there was a genius about Perón in understanding Argentine society at that particular moment, and how it was that you could bring some people together in a large enough coalition that you could actually try to run the country.
Sure, he was a very clever, very charismatic man, and also very learned man.
And not very ideal.
He had been also military attaché in Italy. He had seen the rise of fascism.
Yeah.
So this is not a man,
So,
you know.
he had a smart political sense, and he had Eva. And Eva Perón was the beloved figure with the people. She would go mingle with the people, hand out money, and they would have lotteries, and she was seen, some called her a saint. She was a sainted figure when she died. What of that do you think? That understanding, he was certainly the biggest, Juan and Eva were certainly the biggest political figures in Bergoglio's childhood. What of that do you think he took with him as a model of leadership and as a vision of how to absorb the aspirations of a people and lead?
Well, I think the Pope does make use of, let's say, a populist mode of greeting people. I was in Rome, a year ago, and I went to the general audience, and he spent a lot of time in the Pope-mobile going through the square. Now, popes have always done that, so this is nothing new.
No.
But it's clear from the way he, for instance, he's had a couple of meetings now with these so-called popular movements, which are basically socialist-type organizations, and he's met with them. And it's interesting because Peronism viewed itself as a halfway between capitalism and socialism. It viewed itself as a third way. Most economists say there's no such thing. But in fact, that kind of spirit in these meetings that the Pope has had, his criticism of capitalism, free market, et cetera, we'll talk more about that as we go along. But it does sound somewhat like this Peronistic ideal that we are going to be in a different way, and we're going to be for the people. And you know, it's an interesting thing. I'd be interested in Father Cid's take on that.
But in the first Peronista government from 1946 on, Perón had many gestures towards the church, and there were many members of his government that were leading Catholic intellectuals of the time.
Right.
I think, for example, of Arturo Sampay, the man who drafted the Constitution of 1949. But later it turned sour, and especially after the death of Eva Perón, when corruption became rampant. So much so that he turned against the church, and then became very hostile to the church, and then he suppressed also the opposition. So in 1955, the Corpus Christi procession became an outlet for the opposition to gather in a public place, and a few days after that, there was an attempted coup that failed. In retaliation for that, the Peronista hordes had many of the historic churches in downtown Buenos Aires burned to the ground, and Perón expelled bishops.
Yeah.
So Perón was no Marxist for sure, but he turned against the church, even so much so that Pius XII excommunicated him.
Yeah.
Later on, the excommunication was lifted, and before he went back to Argentina, he stopped in Rome, and I'm not sure, but I think he even met with Paul VI.
Still, it strikes me that there's a rough parallel between Peronismo maybe at its best and what Jorge Bergoglio began to do in Argentina, because he shows so much a kind of affinity for the kinds of social formations that the Peronista had at one point, where there's a very concrete personal set of relationships with other people, and you're not dealing with an ideology or ideas so much as you're dealing with a kind of a movement and a personal relationship with a whole network of people.
Yeah.
We've talked about this before privately as well as on air, that as the Pope said yesterday in his opening remarks, and then again today, that persons are more important than ideas, and that serving others is not ideological. Well, there are problems with saying that persons are more important than ideas, and not least that's an idea itself that you want to follow. Yeah. But we know what he means by that. He means that the abstractions, they can be good, they cannot be good, they may be right, they may be partly right, they may be wrong, but the real thing at the end of the day we want to do is to be able to serve other people. And insofar as the truth, reality, etc., lead us to serve other people, that's really the reason why we have ideas.
Sure. I would say, yeah, I think, but going back to what you were saying before about populism and Peronism, Perón saw the party which he founded, which is called the Justicialista Party, only as an electoral tool. Yeah. He always spoke of his...
he was really a dictator.
He always referred to the movement. Yeah. This is a movement. The political party was just a legal instrument for elections. He spoke of the movement that had its branches, the trade unions, the political branch, the women's branch, you know. And so, but what I would say, what I would nuance to what Mr. Royal was saying, is that I don't think that it's that the Pope is influenced by Perón. It's the other way around. I had a professor of, a Cuban, by the way, my professor of...
What's the other way around, though?
The populist, the influence, because Argentina, Latin America in general, the culture is suffused with Catholic values, including justice, social justice. That's why they resonate in the minds and the souls of Latin Americans.
And that Perón was tapping into the yearning for social justice.
As Chavez does, as Castro Correa does, as Castro does. It's the other way around. It's these people are profiting,
manipulating and profiting Catholic social teaching. That's
exactly. It's because the culture is suffused with Catholic values that these people find their niche, and then they exploit and twist and corrupt, manipulate the minds of the people. And implement these populist regimes.
One of our correspondents here, whose name I won't mention on air, he tweets in, "You seem to forget Jesus said, 'Judge not lest you be judged,' and economic injustice provided the environment in Cuba for the rise of Castro." Father Jerry?
Well, you know, no society is perfect, and that doesn't mean that they deserve a communist dictatorship. Castro tricked the people. He did not come in at the beginning saying that he was a Soviet tool, but he realized in order to become the dictator, he needed the support of the Soviets. Social justice is absolutely at the core of Catholic teaching, and we try and implement it in a monarchy, in a democracy, in a republic, whatever you have. I would say that you know, you have to use your judgment to figure out what is according to justice. So that simple phrase, "Don't judge Castro because you don't live in a perfect society," for instance, that's ridiculous.
And besides, we're just said that we hope against hope that the Pope urges him to convert, and that he does. But I mean, we do not judge what's in his heart, but clearly oppressing your people is wrong. Murdering people is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we can judge that.
Yes.
I mean, I think when you're rounding up kids and sending them to education camps, that's probably not a good thing.
Sure.
Abolishing parental rights and sending
Sure.
children away from their parents is wrong. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah, and that goes on, and we haven't even talked about that, the sort of the re-education that has been a long hallmark of this regime.
But now listen, let's recognize what happened right at the beginning. We were talking about what did Castro do back in the day. Well, you know, when he comes into Havana triumphant, he's got a rosary around his neck and pictures are taken of this, and it looks like, you know, Jesus the Revolutionary.
Right, Braveheart.
A lot of people kind of melded these two things together. Within a short while, we've got Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, which seems to be a large distance away from social justice and you know, Christian democracy and those sorts of things. And then, of course, we see all the other developments that occur with Cuba. So, yeah, we don't judge him, but we see an awful lot of activity that gives us the impression that maybe some of this was for public consumption and was actually hypocritical.
Yeah. So again, this is a fascinating thing, I think, for those in the United States and Europe particularly to look into, to get into the mind of the Pope as he comes here and engages this regime. And I don't want to lose sight and pretend, I think, that, you know, this is some rosy paradise that the Pope walks in here. This is a very conflicted, suffering people. And despite the happy images on occasions like this, when you see him going in a presidential palace or at a nice meeting with people, these are suffering people, and any of us who've been there, you all have spent more time than I have, you see that suffering up close.
It's worth, I mean, we've been talking about clarifying for people what life is actually like and dispelling some misimpressions. The guidebooks about Cuba, and you can read these before you go down there if you're going to take a trip and you know, try to figure this out for yourself. The guidebooks systematically lie about what things are like in Cuba. I took Father Newhouse and George Weigel and some other friends to one of Ernest Hemingway's famous bars, the Floridita, which is at the end of the Calle del Obispo, the famous Calle del Obispo. At the other end of the Calle del Obispo, Ernest Hemingway wrote Old Man and the Sea at the Hotel Ambos Mundos. But the guidebooks tell you, oh, it's this wonderful, lively street of shops and whatnot. Well, there are iron beams holding the walls up from collapsing down on you as you walk down the street. And that was 17 years ago. I imagine it's even much worse now. And anybody who would do that to their own people, we have to take that very seriously about what it says about them.
We are also hearing some reports that the Pope is now meeting with Raúl Castro behind closed doors, for those of you just joining us. That is at the presidential palace. We have just this still shot, which almost looks like something out of a, you know, a Stalinist
or it
cartoon.
It looks like Nuremberg, Nazi Germany.
Yeah. I mean, you see there's a red carpet literally going up to the front door there. That's the only image we have. That's the external. We're waiting for the Pope to emerge from this, as he should in the next few minutes. Then he proceeds to the cathedral in Havana. He will pray there with his priests, religious seminarians, and I am being told, getting a few emails now, that it appears that some of the dissidents who were rounded up yesterday to prevent them from attending the Mass are going to meet him at the Havana Cathedral. We'll see if that happens. If that is indeed what transpires here, this will be the first time a Pope has met with the dissident community in any visible way. We'll see. That's just some reporters on the ground are sending me things here. We'll see if that turns out to be true. Your thoughts on as we watch this, what real impact does this have? Meetings like this, no doubt these images will be sent all over Cuba via national television. Does this give legitimacy to Raul Castro, or does he have the only legitimacy on the block? I mean, it doesn't matter.
You know, he's in charge, but the regime looks weak when an anti-Christian regime has to have the Pope here as their honored guest. And it really reflects the conflict that's at the heart of this communist takeover in Cuba. The Cuban people are Christian at heart. It's a Catholic country. The Sacred Heart of Jesus is at the center of Cuban existence. The Cuban patriots and history all revolve around preserving the Christian character. So when Castro and he are talking, the subject has to be, what are you going to do to allow your people the freedom that you took away from them when your brother took over this country? And that 2 million exiles enjoy it elsewhere. They'd love to enjoy it back at home. I think you know, dictators are always on the edge of being overthrown. In Cuba, sad to say, it hasn't happened, but they're always worried. That's how I look at it.
Here's the shot inside. You see the guards standing by. in our shot anyway. I know you're still watching the protest video. Those are protesters being arrested. But this is the external, or the exterior rather, of the door that Raúl Castro and Pope Francis are behind. They're having a private meeting in the Palace of the Revolution. And we're waiting for this meeting to wrap up, which should happen momentarily. The Pope will then make his way to Havana's cathedral, which isn't terribly far away. And here they come. Looks like the doors are opening up. Wrong guy. We're still waiting.
Raymond, I would add to what Father said. Don't forget Our Lady of Charity. You mentioned Ernest Hemingway. When he received the Nobel Prize in Literature, he wanted to give it to the Cuban people, and he found no better way to express that desire than to give it to Our Lady of Charity in El Cobre. And the medallion, I guess, that they get when they get the Nobel Prize, Nobel Prize in Literature, is held in the sanctuary, in the shrine of Our Lady of Charity. So Mary is also very much part of the Cuban identity, one that wasn't the government was unable to stamp out.
That's right.
And we will see that devotion resurrected, if you will, elevated for an international audience tomorrow. The Pope will go to El Cobre and pray at that shrine. Of course, this is a hallmark of any papal visit, where the Pope stops at the Marian shrine for that particular country. Sure. He will do so when he's in Cuba.
And also I was thinking, if I may, if people want to know more about the Argentina where the Pope grew, there are very good books by American authors. I mean, they helped me to learn a lot. So one such book is Army and Politics in Argentina by Robert Potash, a professor here in the US. It's several volumes, very, very good. And there's a biography of Perón by an American author. His last name is Page. That I read it and I learned a lot. So I mean, people,
no, there are great resources out there.
So,
and again, it's
and then they will help people get to know more about the country that the Pope grew in, which obviously shaped him as a human being, and also the circumstances that he faced when he had to exercise his priestly ministry. You know.
Yeah.
No, Argentina is a very Catholic country. I was stationed with Argentinian priests when I was a younger priest in an earlier assignment. No, and the depth of faith there, it's really wonderful. And that's, the communist takeover in Cuba is a wake-up call to the Cuban people that they need to revive their faith. And they're going to take missionaries from Latin America and Spain and America to help them reestablish. We have to pray that what the Pope says to Raúl Castro will have some influence. We hope. The Pope is a priest, as Father was saying. Sure. I mean, I pray for Fidel Castro to die in the state of grace. I think we all should do that. But we have to also pray that when the end of this regime happens, that there's not wide bloodshed and warfare, but rather responsible people will stand up and say the Cuban people determine their own future, and they should do so freely. I think that's the goal.
I want to preview something, since this is in a political context and the Pope is visiting Raúl Castro here as the head of state for the Vatican city-state. I want to touch on something that's happening here in the United States. I meant to get to this yesterday, but we had more pressing things to talk about in Cuba. A representative, Paul Gosar, he is a Republican from Arizona. He wrote an extended piece on townhall.com, and in it he says, and I'll just read this one paragraph, if the Pope wants to devote his life to fighting climate change, then he can do it in his personal time. But to promote questionable science as Catholic dogma is ridiculous. As a result, Representative Gosar is boycotting the Pope's address on Capitol Hill this week. Father Jerry.
Yeah, no, I wrote a response for the LifeSet website, which I think will come out this week. This is a big mistake. When the Pope comes to speak, we should listen, and we should listen attentively and not try and predict ahead of time what he's going to say. It's also a sign of disrespect. He writes, and I believe him, that he's a graduate of Catholic school, a practicing Catholic. Don't try and score political points by making the Pope the butt end of your attack.
Robert Roy.
I wrote a whole book about religion and environmentalism 15 years ago, and I would recommend it to all our viewers out there. So,
what's it called? Go ahead.
It's called The Virgin and the Dynamo.
Oh, The Virgin and the Dynamo, of course.
Yeah, and actually this is from Henry Adams. He talks about most of the art and music and whatnot has been inspired by the Blessed Virgin. And in the modern world, what we have is this machinery and this dynamo.
Mm.
And I go back and forth about how, you know, nature is more allied with the virgin, modern sciences is more allied with the dynamo. But see, the error in this sort of thing, where you take religion and you try to reduce it to political categories, is first of all, the Pope has not made dogmatic pronouncements about the environment.
Right.
When the Pope says that we have a responsibility to care for creation, you know, that goes all the way back to the first chapters of Genesis, and he's absolutely within his rights to say that. Now, having written that book, I could give you all sorts of scientific quarrels about this and that, that's the things that are in
some of the science in that encyclical is open to question and argument.
He's clearly, and I'm going to just say this openly, he's clearly accepted the opinions of some of the most radical environmentalists on the face of the earth today. But that said, so what? That's a sort of passing part of what the message is.
So that's a prudential judgment on the part of the Pope.
To put it in technical terms, it's a prudential judgment. The congressman is simply wrong. This is not dogma. It is a presentation of one of the fundamental differences that Catholics have with the modern view of the world. We view the world as God's creation. We don't view the world the way the materialists do, as simply matter and energy. Fixing our relationship with the world is not simply an engineering problem, even if we could engineer, say, the end of climate change, if you believe it's there or not. It's about fundamentally recognizing what Genesis tells us is our place in God's creation.
Boy, we're going to have an exciting week ahead, I can tell.
I think that it also shows that the representative did not read the encyclical, because the encyclical is not about climate change. The encyclical also allows for a difference of opinion. The Pope explicitly says that in some of the matters that he discusses, there are differences of opinions. There are different opinions, but the encyclical goes extensively into the anthropological crisis of our times, with what the Pope calls a distorted anthropocentrism that is at the root of the environmental problems. It is at the root of the moral problems of our times, and he calls for a renewed vision of man.
But again, I would argue, Father, I agree with you, but I would argue in the popular imagination, these people, the public are not theologians, they're not anthropologists. They read this, and even a congressman, not a
but if you're going to opine,
I agree.
Really.
However,
if you're going to take a stand against it, read it first.
When you read an encyclical and you're told this is papal teaching, it's very hard for the layman to distinguish between theological truth and mere opinion.
Sure.
There. And there's a lot of prudential judgment and science that is open to conjecture.
I agree.
But when you see it in that package, a papal encyclical, it has a weight. And I think that's where a lot of you should see my email box. Oh, people are ripping their hair out over some of the things said. And I'm sure we're going to hear it this week, because there's no doubt, I have it on good authority, that the UN speech is going to contain a lot of the environmental message, and we're going to hear some of that in Congress as well. So this discussion, I'm going to suspend. The chair is going to table that amendment until later time. But it's a really good point, though, that this is the theological context is sound. The rest is up for.
And then if you're going to take a stand, read the document.
Exactly. At least read it, and don't call it dogma when it's not. Now we are seeing the security team, the Praetorian Guard there in Havana, make their way out. Pope Francis exiting the meeting with Raúl Castro. I almost said Fidel Castro. And
relatively short, I think, for what the many things they must have had to talk about. Well, it was
almost an hour, that meeting. They were almost in there for 45 minutes, 50 minutes.
But after hearing his confession, that must have left just a few minutes to go.
A few minutes to convince about what's on the dining menu tonight. Now they're making his way, the Pope is making his way out. He will proceed to the Havana Cathedral. And
first the elevator.
Yeah, first the elevator shot. And again, we are hearing some reports, and these are unconfirmed, that the Pope may be meeting with some dissidents at Havana, the Havana Cathedral. We will find out together, because we're going to bring this to you live as it happens.
There's not a lot of chumminess that I don't see in the way they're walking out. I mean, they're smiling.
There's an unveiling. There's an unveiling happening.
Oh, here we go.
The crucifix.
Oh, this is very dramatic at the revolution, and the president himself is getting in on the act. Look, he's pulling the The reveal. Dun, dun, dun. It's a big crucifix.
Oh, well, that's beautiful.
Wow.
Wow, look at that.
It's a carved crucifix on some very rough wood. I wonder what the origins of this are, or I mean, was this made for the Pope? Is this a gift?
Oars? Are those?
I think.
Well, they're metal. They're metal bars. They're metal. It's metal. It's a metal cross, essentially, like made of pipe, and the corpus is atop it.
I could. I would
Oars.
have to check.
Oh, they're oars.
Yeah, they are.
Probably a reference to the people seeking who've died in the rafts, maybe?
I'd be surprised.
Or maybe the restoration of a famous crucifix that at one point in time sat in Cuba. I will have to verify that. But it's possibly, because I understand that there was a restoration going on.
Well, the corpus is beautiful. I mean,
Yeah.
it is very striking.
They are oars, though.
Yeah,
That is
they
what
are
that
oars.
is. They're absolutely oars with some with metal poles attached. Others are wooden, but it's sort of a collection of those tied together, and the corpus of Jesus' body is atop it. This must be the artist telling the Pope about it. I don't know if this is, I imagine this is a gift to the Pope, and maybe the oars represent the people who died trying to cross the straits
I don't
to
know.
get to Florida.
I don't know.
Anything better than a hammer and sickle?
Well, the question arises as you watch this, as you listen to that, what's happening here to make all the people get in the boats to go?
Absolutely, no. And this is a picture of Our Lady of Charity.
Of course, somebody stepped right in the shot. The cameraman is... Yeah, this is an image of Our Lady of Charity, which is very likely a gift of the Pope to Raúl Castro.
If those are oars, it's very striking at this moment, given that Europe has got this crisis of refugees, people trying to cross the Mediterranean from Libya, drowning in the process. And that's precisely what's happened between Cuba and the United States, that people fleeing repression on the island. Some make it here, but many have died, too.
You know, it's a beautiful image to see Jesus, the crucifix, in the Palace of the Revolution. Christ died for all men, and absolutely his blood washes clean the sins of all. And he
now-
justifies those who die for him.
Now some more photos here. A final handshake with Raúl Castro before the Pope makes his way to this meeting at the Havana Cathedral, which he's late for. Not that he's abiding by my schedule, but he is late. We got a wonderful tweet just landed. It says, I'm enjoying the Pope in Cuba presentation on EWTN. God bless Mother Angelica and the EWTN team. And that's Phil from Lagos, Nigeria, watching. And I think I've been very forward about this throughout our coverage. I'm particularly mindful of Mother Angelica because these visits were such a part of the impetus for founding EWTN. And when that first papal visit happened in the 90s, that she, well, it was actually the late 80s, and then later into the 90s, to bring these visits to people were such an important part of the mission of EWTN and something she felt very strongly about. Cardinal Jaime Ortega taking in this crucifix, a gift apparently from Raúl Castro to Pope Francis on his first visit to this island nation. First time not only in Cuba, but soon in the United States.
And Mother Angelica's vision to bring the Pope to the world through satellite television and now through the internet is truly transformative. I don't think we can underestimate the importance that people have to have that direct connection to the Pope and to see when he's exercising this ministry of going out to the world what it means. I mean, Christianity is not a dying force in the world. It's very much alive, and the Catholic Church is interested in the salvation of all, and that's why the Pope travels.
Yeah. It's very interesting because Mother Angelica, really, the impetus to found EWTN, the inspiration was in 1978, almost at the exact moment of John Paul's election. And their paths really were parallel because her faith allowed and created the vehicle that brought really John Paul to the whole world in a way that before that was just unheard of.
Right.
Not only to people via shortwave and cable, but later through the internet and so many other ways. AM/FM radio affiliates now up to 300. I mean, it really is an astounding footprint when you stand back and think that it all started with this cloistered nun in the woods of Birmingham, Alabama.
No, and if the church is going to present itself as what it truly is, which is not a political party, it's not an ideology, it's not an NGO, it's a non-governmental organization, as Pope Francis has often said. We have to see images like this. We have to hear messages that are other messages than just that attempt to try to either capture the Pope for Cuba or the United States, for the Republicans or the Democrats. I've been talking to a lot of secular media this week, and the very first thing I tell all of them is, if you read the Pope and you read the Catholic Church through the lenses of American politics, Republicans and Democrats, you'll miss him. That already reduces him to something that we're already familiar with.
Exactly.
He's got something else to bring us.
Yep. And we will see that unfold, that message. And look, like the conversation we were having a moment ago when we referenced this Representative Gosar, there's a lot of conversation to be had because the Church's view, as well as Francis' view, is complex when it comes to these economic, justice issues, environmental issues. They are not going to cohere to one party or the other. And you see some individuals and individual parties and ideologies, to use the Pope's term, trying to sort of wrap their arms around him and claim him as their own. He's not going to fit in either of these political parties in the United States or in any that we're seeing as he travels through Cuba and elsewhere.
I hope when he's here next week we have a chance, and he has a chance, to raise up this notion of the human ecology. John Paul II started to talk about this, but it's not simply that question of how do we relate to the physical world. It's how humanity, how the very essence of being human has to be recognized and fostered within a total vision. And this is what's somewhat confusing for some environmentalists, that he can step forward and care about creation, but also say the way to protect creation is not to abort human beings in the womb, it's not to disregard life at the end with the elderly, but it's to foster humanity all along the way. And that in itself, if we understand it in the right way, the anthropology, as you keep saying, Father Seed, is a key that joins together the human and the natural.
Jaime Ortega with Pope Francis and Raúl Castro making their way out of this Palace of the Revolution. The Pope is going to get in his vehicle and in a moment proceed to the Havana Cathedral. As we said earlier, I am hearing reports that the Pope could be meeting, with the dissident community, some of whom were arrested the other day, to keep them from any meeting with the Pope. Now, if we're hearing about that, no doubt the Castro regime has as well. So we'll see if this meeting actually takes place. But that is what we're hearing. If you have a question about any of this, tweet me. I'm at Raymond Arroyo, or you can send us an email at papalvisit@ewtn.com. Our team there is forwarding many of those questions my way, and we will try to get to them. This is a good time, actually, when the Pope is traveling. I always like these moments because it allows us to sort of get into the questions that sometimes we don't have an opportunity for. There is something in these emails I'm reading, and it's something that we can discuss further as the Pope comes to the United States. But it's people who are conflicted about Pope Francis. Some say they're very eager to watch. They want to embrace him, and yet there's some hesitance. And I think some of that comes from the reportage of his economic critiques and the reportage of his environmental message, or half-reading quotes and not fully understanding what's here or what is actually at play. This is not dogma. This is not defined teaching.
This is an area when the Pope has a particular view on some scientific questions such as climate change or economic science, and he presents them as what he thinks is necessary to be done. Respectfully, you can say, Holy Father, for the following reason, I don't agree with you. In fact, you can advocate for that position. I remember Pope John Paul II was against the first Gulf War.
Yes, he was.
And, you know, American Catholic soldiers went over there and fought it. They were not bad Catholics as a result. Pope Benedict was in favor of lifting the embargo, as is Pope Francis. Many people were not in favor of it. These are debatable points. Sometimes in Europe, we're a little more familiar with the notion of the politics of the Holy See as regards things that they like to see done. For us, you know, in the United States, often our idea is if the Pope says it, you got to do it. And when it comes to the Catholic Church's creed and dogma, absolutely. In fact, if you want to be a good Catholic, you follow the papal teaching. It's the security that we get from Christ. But you're entitled to disagree. You know, I read those encyclicals. Some of the economic pronouncements I found a little bit strange. The criticism of air conditioning, for instance, in the encyclical.
Well, in this room, I bet you would.
Right now,
you could hang meat in here. I like a nice, chilly studio.
This is Arctic in Washington here right now.
Well, that's okay. We've
But
got
it's
to
not
look.
bad.
There's half a cow in the
It's
corner.
not bad, not bad. But no, and this is something, you know, as a priest, I counsel people. I'm sure Father Sid is the same. People feel uneasy. Say, well, the Pope said I should do this climate change.
Right.
Say, well, look, read it, think about it. If you disagree with it, respond. You're not doing anything wrong.
I want to share one email before we take a little break, and we are awaiting the start of the Pope's visit to the Havana Cathedral, and I'll read this email. It's a nice introduction. Felix writes, having suffered terribly for being practicing Catholics and attending catechism classes secretly, it pains me and my Cuban brothers and sisters to see not only the Castro brothers, but those who carry out and support them today, greeted warmly by the leaders of our church. If Pope Francis truly wants to be on the side of the most unfortunate, then I pray he makes time while in Cuba to meet with those who bravely dissent and are imprisoned for freedom of expression and faith. If the reports that we're hearing hold true, Felix, the Pope is about to meet with some of those dissidents. We hope you all will stay tuned. The papal posse will stay in place, as will I. We are going to take a little break. When we return, the Pope will be approaching or in the Havana Cathedral. Stay right there. EWTN News live coverage of Pope Francis in Cuba continues in a moment.